Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Maintaining Balance Under Stress webinar. As I mentioned, we are recording this for on-demand viewing later. So just so you're aware, we are recording. I'm Kathy Cox. I'm Chief of Staff for Greenleaf Integrative. I've been with the company for 6 years, working with a variety of our clients, including the USAID mission in Jordan. It's great to be here with you today. And joining me is Trevor Dangle, our Trauma Prevention and Mitigation Specialist.
Hi, everyone. I'm Trevor. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm a clinical psychologist and mental health practitioner by training. I've published research in the past on drivers of human well-being, including on topics like gratitude and mindfulness. And I've got a pretty extensive background in the neuroscience of stress and trauma, and all of that is very relevant to today's webinar. So I'm really excited to talk about it with you all.
Thanks. So let's do a quick review of our objectives for today. We're going to talk about how our neurobiology and our environment influence our perception of stressors and the importance of using positive framing strategies to assist in that perception. We will learn to differentiate between balanced and unbalanced interpretations, and we're going to practice a few tools and techniques to promote balanced thinking. In fact, we'll be doing several exercises with you today, and we hope you'll follow along doing them with us. They're simple, and you'll just be sitting where you are now and following along silently in your mind. If you're in the office today, others around you won't even notice. Before we dive in, let's cover a few housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded today for on-demand viewing. It will be available on a web page along with a list of resources, some handouts, and copies of a presentation. This is the final of the 3 webinars on this subject, and they are all available on that same web page with all the related materials. I've dropped a link to that web page in the chat, and we'll also be sharing it with you by email. We will be using chat today, so you may want to have that open, and I'll be monitoring it. If you have any technical difficulties, please let me know in the chat, and I'll see if I can help you resolve them. Chat is also a great place to add your comments and questions. We will have time at the end for Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer any questions either at that time or that you put in the chat during the presentation. It's also a great place to indicate your agreement or enthusiasm for anything that's being said. And you can do that if you don't want to type a whole comment. You can do that by simply just adding +1. It's the equivalent of saying "me too." So if you want to share your agreement with anything, feel free to just add +1. Before we get started, Trevor's going to lead us in a brief centering exercise.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. So at Greenleaf, we have a practice of opening up meetings with a brief moment of centering and focusing. And we'd like to do that with you today and hope that if you find it as useful as we do, that you'll make it a practice in your own team meetings possibly. So group centering exercises are a great way to start meetings because it gets everyone in the room and mentally focused on the task at hand. And each of the webinars in the series does use a different kind of centering practice. So today we'll be doing a brief mindful breathing exercise just to show you the different variety of the kinds of exercises that there are. So we'll go ahead and get started. This is just going to be about 2 minutes. And if your camera's on, you might feel more comfortable turning it off during this exercise. And now we'll go ahead and get started. So first, take a moment and just find a comfortable position. You can be sitting or lying down and have your eyes closed or open. And once you're settled, I'd like you to focus your attention on the sensation of breathing. And you can just breathe normally. You don't have to do anything special. And I'd like you to try to keep as much of your attention as you can on the breath. And notice where you feel your breath most distinctly. Is it at the tip of your nose? Perhaps in the rising and falling of your chest? Or perhaps it's deep in your stomach. And wherever it is most noticeable for you, see if you can hold your attention fully on that sensation for one full breath in and out without getting lost in a thought. And if that's easy for you, perhaps try doing this for 2 full breaths or even 3. And just simply keep noticing your breath as it comes and goes in each moment, remembering that there is only this moment right here and right now. And if your mind begins to wander, that's okay. Simply notice that you've been distracted without any judgment or criticism, and gently return to the sensation of breathing. And then when you're ready, I'd like you to gently bring your attention back to the meeting. You can open your eyes if they were closed and return to your chair, possibly if you happen to be lying down. Give everyone a moment here. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope that leaves you feeling more centered today to start our meeting.
Yeah, that was great, Trevor. Thanks so much. So let's dive in.
Great. All right. So this word balance keeps coming up a lot through today's webinar. And so we thought it'd be important to start by talking more about what we actually mean by being balanced, because sometimes this word balance can have a connotation that we mean, all positivity all the time. And so you'll see here on the slide, there's just a comparison of what being balanced is and what being balanced is not. So first, being balanced does not mean that we always need to have an equal amount of positive and negative in all situations at all times. Rather, this means that we accept the reality of whatever the situation happens to be, including both the positive and negative aspects. So as an example, let's say maybe a friend gets a new job that they really wanted, but then they immediately turn around with the point to say, well, yeah, but I didn't get that salary increase that I wanted. Or on the opposite end, maybe somebody is in the midst of a crisis and they're just told, well, hey, you still have it way better than a lot of other people. So even though both of those statements might be true, the former statement about the not salary increase undermines the great achievement, and the latter statement, but the person in crisis, minimizes the gravity of that person's situation and can be dismissive. Now, this is tricky because sometimes we do need to be consciously reminded of certain details about a situation that we might be ignoring in order to see that situation more clearly. But at the same time, we've probably all experienced situations where someone seemed to be cutting down our positive news in a way that was very unhelpful because they were just trying to be realistic, right? Like, oh, let's not get too positive here. And it just was unhelpful in the moment. Or maybe, on the other hand, we've had the experience of being in a really, truly terrible situation, and someone who's well-intended forces some positivity on us in the moment that just makes things more stressful because it can be hard to feel positive in the moment, and we might feel invalidated when we can't muster those feelings. So to put it in another way, part of being balanced means acknowledging that the positive and negative both have their place in a lot of situations, and they may not always be equal at all times, and that's okay. So just remembering this can help us make decisions and adapt to stressors in ways that do genuinely honor risks and challenges and struggles when they show up without glossing over them. But it can also help us to fully allow for and really deeply savor those positive moments when they show up without needing to cut them down for the sake of realism or, not getting too excited, right? Because we do want to embrace those positive feelings when they show up. Now, being balanced also does not mean that we only focus on preferred information or information that fits just our initial view of the situation. For example, let's say somebody turns down a promotion because they keep repeatedly worrying about having more responsibility or shifting into an unfamiliar role, which fit their initial fear that they wouldn't do well in this promotion. But this person didn't factor in their boss's statements about being able to receive support and a lot of flexibility during that transition, right? They didn't consider that information in their decision to refuse the promotion. Or imagine that a soccer team prematurely celebrates a victory only to be scored on in the final seconds because they weren't paying attention. So in both of those situations, there was information that fit the initial narrative and it was given full priority while other key information was ignored. And this, of course, led to outcomes that neither party wanted. So being balanced also means that we consider as much information about the situation as possible, right? We can't know everything, but we consider as much as possible before we make a decision or interpret a situation. And even if that means the information doesn't always fit how we viewed the situation initially. And finally, being balanced also means that we give the proper weight to the positive and negative aspects of a situation. So no more or no less than what's warranted. Some more examples here. Let's say a colleague spills a drink on themselves early in the morning, and now they say that there's just absolutely no way that they're going to be able to have a good day, right? It's a sign that the entire day now is completely ruined. Or on the other end of the spectrum, maybe somebody gets multiple congratulatory emails for exceptional performance, but they say, well, I'm just doing my job. It's not really exceptional. Please, I don't want that kind of praise. So this spilled drink scenario gives far too much weight to that negative event and allows it to influence that person's entire day. But on the other hand, that person disregarding the praising emails can really block the feelings of joy, recognition, and achievement that really sustain us in the midst of doing difficult work, right? It's important to embrace that. So while our first point emphasized that always requiring that 50-50 even balance of positive and negative can lead to problems, so too can allowing the scales to tilt too far in either direction, right? So the key is to let the scales tilt exactly how they really need to tilt for the situation at hand. So here you'll see a chart that provides a handy comparison of what it might look like when a response reflects a degree of negativity or positivity that's not proportionate to the situation. Now, this is not a set of criteria for gauging how balanced we are as a person, right? Because we've all done some of these at some point and we'll probably do them in the future. And that is perfectly normal. Our brains are in some ways wired to go to these places. So we're showing this just to provide more detail on what we mean by balanced versus unbalanced, rather than using this as a checklist. So just keep that in mind. So on the left, you'll see that too much negativity can cause us to overestimate current threats or dwell on threats that haven't even happened yet. And that can leave us immobilized because we don't make decisions because we're so afraid. And it can also stifle the motivation and creative problem solving that is necessary to cope with challenges or adapt to stress. And finally, not only is too much negativity distressing for ourselves, but it may also project that distress onto others. And this all can leave us feeling stuck, helpless, exhausted, all of those feelings in the face of stress. On the other hand, if we express a disproportionate amount of positivity, problems can also arise. And specifically in this case, problems can arise when we might be facing a really urgent or serious situation, and that excessive positivity causes us to ignore or underestimate very real threats. Right? So this is like being in an emergency and just saying, well, everything's fine, nothing to worry about. Right? And these kinds of responses can also stifle problem solving if they're causing us to rely on just simply hoping for the best and just thinking positive without corresponding action to back that up, right? You need that pairing. And these sort of disproportionately positive statements can also be hurtful to those that are affected by a problem or those in crisis. So as well intended as they are, saying things like, well, you just have to think positive, or you just need to look on the bright side when there is a very serious crisis, those can sometimes feel dismissive or imply that the person's negative feelings about the situation aren't valid. So finding balance means responding in a way that has assessed the whole situation, right? All that information that we can get. It provides solutions while also acknowledging and accepting those barriers or limitations that are often present. And it also validates the harm that the situation causes while also fostering hope or the sense that there is a path forward again. So it's both and, right? Now, humans, for our purposes today and what we're talking about, humans often tend to overestimate the significance of negative information while underestimating the positive information. And this is especially true in the midst of chronic stress. So finding ways to balance a little more intentionally toward the positive is going to be the running theme throughout our webinar today. Now let's talk more about this tendency toward the negative and why this happens in the first place. So I'll start here that while it's true that negativity can very easily influence our attention, humans are by and large generally positive. I'd like to start with that caveat. So if you ask a random person at a random moment how they're feeling, people will generally rate their mood or their outlook as positive. And I'm sharing this so that we all can understand that people aren't just doom and gloom all the time by default, right? Fortunately, humans tend to be pretty optimistic for the most part. But today's discussion is about what happens when we're faced with repeated threats or stressors, and these can make us especially vulnerable to negativity. And this is just a direct result of the way our brains work. It's how we're wired in some ways. So the human brain is designed to take shortcuts, and this is for very good reason. There's just too much information in our environment to really be able to fully process all of that information at all times. So these mental shortcuts that our brain takes can be very helpful for us to make quick decisions or filter out unnecessary or irrelevant information. There's probably all kinds of things happening in your environment that are being filtered out right now. But the problem is these shortcuts and these filters can also cause us to systematically ignore certain kinds of critical information. And this can cause us to have a routinely skewed perspective on certain situations. So let's talk about a few examples that are of these shortcuts that are especially relevant for today's topic. So first, when given a choice between equally positive and negative information, our brain will very much tend to prioritize the negative information. It'll go there first. And this is referred to as the negativity bias. So for example, negative information tends to elicit, excuse me, more brain activity, right? We pay more attention to negative news stories than positive ones. And we focus more quickly on negative rather than positive information. And we tend to dwell on negative events more so than positive ones, right? We're much more likely to dwell on an insult than we are to dwell on a compliment. So this means that our attention gets easily skewed in some ways to automatically favor negative information, even when we're not stressed, right? This imbalance is already there in some ways. But when we're in a high stress environment, there's plenty of negative information to go around to capture our attention, and it can make it even easier to fall into this bias. And we also tend to seek out and more easily notice information that already fits with our pre-existing beliefs, and we ignore information that doesn't fit this belief. So this is known as confirmation bias. So humans have a natural tendency to ignore information that doesn't quite fit their narrative of a situation, even if that information is very convincing or sensible. And this is true whether our narrative is positive or negative, right? We want to believe the information that already fits with our beliefs. But under chronic stress, our narratives can become quite negative if our stress is left unchecked, and it can make it very hard for us to see the positive aspects of situations that maybe don't fit our negative narrative. And then finally, when we think back on our memories, our brains heavily overemphasize the emotions that we felt during the peak of the experience and the end of the experience. So this tendency was discovered by a widely renowned psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, and his team of researchers, and it's come to be known as the peak end rule. So as some examples of this, imagine that you're attending an outdoor festival or some other outdoor social gathering. Things are maybe going very well, and then suddenly a terrible storm comes and it causes the event to end early, right? Everyone is scrambling to get to shelter, and safety in the storm is quite terrible. So if this were to happen to you, your memory of that event will overwhelmingly be about this terrible storm, if you even remember anything else about the event. And you'll likely view that memory with feelings of perhaps disappointment or even fear if it was a really, really bad storm, even though the vast majority of your experience of that event was great until just that small portion at the very end, right? Even though just that small portion was negative, you'll remember the whole thing as a negative experience. Or as an example of something in the middle of an event, imagine you're at a restaurant, and again, things are going very well until you happen to be given the wrong order. So you send your food back, and then you eventually get exactly what you ordered, and the evening finishes out with no problems, but you had to wait another 20 minutes for your food because of this mix-up. So again, your memory of this event is most likely going to center around those negative, frustrated feelings you had during the mix-up. And suddenly you're not very fond of this restaurant, even though 80 out of the 100 minutes you were there were great. So under chronic stress, this peak end rule bias can make us very prone to recalling stressors as much more negative than they actually were, right? We take this one snippet of an event and make it representative of the entire experience, which isn't always true.
This is great information, Trevor. Your mention of the concert with the storm reminds me of a situation I experienced, and I'm recognizing now that that's a shortcut. I was at a concert, and the person next to me, not with my group, was behaving really obnoxiously, not towards me, but just in general, and behaved really obnoxiously the entire concert. And while the concert was great, and one of my favorite artists, I had third row seats, it was a highlight of my summer. When I think of that concert, the first thing I think about is that obnoxious person. And then I have
Right.
to stop and remind myself, yeah, but the rest of the thing, you know, the whole rest of the event was wonderful. So I'm recognizing, yeah, that's a shortcut.
Yeah, exactly. And so now knowing that our brain takes these kinds of shortcuts, we can work around it to try to think about the situation in a more balanced way, right? So even though your initial memory might involve that disruptive person, you can be aware of that and try to take a more objective stance toward the event and remember all the other good things about it, like maybe if your favorite song was played. So let's talk a little bit more about why chronic stress makes us more vulnerable to these shortcuts. It's important to know so again, we can combat that. So first, we'll touch briefly on some key brain areas for the stress response. So the first is the prefrontal cortex, and this is the area right toward the front of our head here, and it is responsible for what we'll call higher order thinking, right? It's really the thinking part of our brain. It uses logic, abstract reasoning, and it's in charge of complex decision making. And then toward the bottom of our brain and really deep toward the middle of our heads, we have the amygdala. So this part of the brain is responsible for detecting threats and generating the emotional response of fear. So when a threat is detected, the amygdala and our prefrontal cortex, they communicate quite rapidly to decide how are we going to handle this threat and avoid danger. But as stress becomes chronic or very severe, our brain begins to adapt. So what it starts doing is dedicating fewer brain connections and less energy toward these tasks of complex thinking, careful planning and action, or any of those really higher order thinking skills, because it wants to save its energy and resources to constantly be on the lookout for threats, right? So it goes into a bit of a survival mode essentially. And this is why we're prone to maybe snap at people, say things we would normally say during periods of stress. We might make hasty decisions that normally we'd consider more carefully, or we might miss key information that normally we would catch. And this is because our brain has just stopped dedicating resources to those kinds of tasks. And then over time, this constant vigilance and over reliance on shortcuts, because we just don't have the energy to, not take the shortcut, this can put us in a state of exhaustion or overwhelm, or start to cause breakdowns in our work if we begin making mistakes. And so without the tools to intentionally break that cycle of negativity and promote a little bit more balance, our well-being becomes at risk. Now, fortunately, over the last 20 or so years, there has been a huge explosion of research into the methods that people use to remain resilient in the midst of, pretty significant stress. And through that research, we've learned that these biases can be countered, and we can train our brains to be at least less susceptible to them. We can't always counter them, but we can certainly get a bit of an advantage over them. So several of these methods involve consciously, right, intentionally rebalancing our perspective on situations like we've been mentioning. So the techniques we'll talk about today can be done in a very short time span, and they can be beneficial even in high stress environments, right? These aren't just for mildly irritating situations. These can have pretty significant effects if used with practice. And because these techniques will literally change and strengthen vital connections between key brain areas, again, with routine use and practice, doing these things over time can make them more automatic, right? We can do it without even having to consciously think about it. and it can make us more resistant to these biases in the first place. And this same process of forming new brain connections, that happens anytime that we learn anything new, possibly like a new language or some new skill, like even cooking. There's always brain connections being formed, and resilience skills are no exception. So it's all the same mental processes happening. So while the information you've heard up to this point may have sounded rather pessimistic, we're sharing it to empower you with the knowledge that that negativity can be counterbalanced, right? So overall, this is hopefully very positive. So let's think about today a few of the skills that we can use to do this, to find this balance. So today we'll talk about mindfulness, gratitude, and self-compassion. And so as we talk about these, it's important to note that these tools can cause us to relate to ourselves in the world in very new and possibly very different ways if we're not used to thinking in these new patterns. So even if these are welcome changes, such a big change might be jarring for some people, right? Again, it's a new skill. We're not used to it. It takes some getting used to. So if you work to incorporate these practices, which we hope you do, just do so at a pace that's comfortable for you, right? This is going to take some time and some patience.
You know, Trevor, one thing I've learned in my mindfulness practice is that, well, in many things in my life, doing that behavior one time doesn't change the brain. I think of it kind of like muscle memory. The more I practice it, the stronger that muscle gets, and the easier it is when I go back to practice it again or I need it in that moment of stress. The more I've practiced it, the stronger that muscle is, and the easier it is for it to just jump in and help reduce the stress. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It definitely takes a good bit of practice for those brain connections to really form and become solidified. But fortunately, as we'll talk about through the rest of the webinar, these practices are often quite quick. So this practice doesn't have to be 2 hours a day, right, to develop this skill. You can develop these skills with short bursts of practice. So we'll start today with mindfulness as our first resilience tool. Now, mindfulness is one of, if not the most heavily studied resilience skills, and its popularity has, understandably, it's generated a lot of debate and confusion about what exactly it is. Now, different academic definitions might vary in the words they use or what parts of mindfulness they emphasize, but for our purposes today, just think of mindfulness as fully attending to the present moment without passing judgment or dwelling on it. So by fully attending, what we mean is we're just placing all of our awareness into what's happening right at this very moment. And by that, we mean this very small fraction of a second that we call the present, like that one small window of time. And we try to stay there in the present rather than being pulled away by thoughts or worries, getting pulled into the past or thinking about the future. Now, bodily sensations, thoughts, emotions, memories, sight, sounds, all these experiences and others are naturally going to arise as we are trying to stay in the present moment. So to be mindful means that we're allowing all of these things to come and go naturally as they want without passing judgment on them or trying to push them away or hold on to them really tightly. As an example, let's say maybe an irritating thought pops into your mind. So to be mindful here, first we have to notice that the thought's happening, where we get so caught up a lot of the time in thoughts or feelings that we just get swept away by them without consciously being aware that we're even having that thought or feeling. And then once we've noticed this thought, this irritating thought, we can welcome its presence, turn toward it without judgment or having to do anything with the thought. We can just let it be. And then we can gently bring ourselves back to the present moment as soon as we notice we've been distracted by whatever the thought happens to be. So this is much different than trying to suppress the thought or get swept up in it, because this generally is only going to prolong the thought even longer. And with mindfulness, the thought may still hang around for a bit, right? The goal isn't to get rid of it as quickly as we can. We're letting it come and go as we please, but this is okay, right? We can acknowledge that this thought's there and it might come back again, but we let it come and go as it needs to while still keeping our primary focus on the present moment rather than getting wrapped up in it, right? Perhaps we ground ourselves in our breathing or the sensation of our body in the chair. There's a lot of ways to connect with the present moment, and many of those are in the resources handout that we've provided. But what they all have in common is they provide us with some way to direct our attention to the here and now and keep it there. So mindfulness has also been described in a lot of other ways that are misleading or inaccurate. So for example, it's not getting rid of our thinking or just thinking only happy thoughts. That would be nice, but generally that's not possible. So thoughts and feelings, especially negative ones, are inevitably going to arise during mindfulness. And these are actually crucial that they happen. This is because distraction is a core part of mindfulness. So the goal of mindfulness isn't to get into a state where we're not thinking or only have happy thoughts. Rather, the goal is to just get better at noticing these inevitable distractions more quickly and bringing ourselves back to the present more quickly. So to summarize, it's this act of repeatedly noticing we're distracted and returning to the present, right? That cycle. Oh, I've been distracted. I bring myself back. That's the essence of mindfulness. I once heard this referred to as that it's a bicep curl for your brain every time you bring yourself back to the present moment. And this is why mindfulness is so helpful with maintaining balance. So think of it as training your brain to get better at noticing when you've been distracted. So by honing the skill, we're able to more quickly notice when worries, knee-jerk impulses, or angry thoughts have taken hold of our attention or our behavior. And then once we come back to the present, we're in a better position to take a more balanced look at whatever's bothering us. And even if a stressor is quite significant or perhaps even very urgent, being able to have that mindful, centered stance can help us make clearer decisions or stay regulated in the midst of some pretty high stress situations, rather than being at the mercy of whatever strong emotion we happen to feel at the moment. Now, for each of the balancing tools that we discussed today, we'd like to invite you to take an opportunity to practice those with us. In the case of mindfulness, we've actually already done a mindfulness technique today, and that was our centering exercise at the beginning of the webinar. And the same thing is true if you've participated in any of the other webinars in the series, and they all have examples throughout of different mindfulness exercises. So for the sake of time, we're not going to do another mindfulness exercise today, but we certainly invite you to practice these techniques as often as you need. Right? These could include things like breathing, body scans, or sensory activities like drinking hot tea or taking a mindful walk and noticing what you see as you take that walk. And again, our resources handout has a lot of information on those different techniques and even some mindfulness apps for those that are interested. So now we'll move on to our next tool, which is gratitude. Now, when we hear this word, we might tend to think of giving thanks to people for specific things that they've done to help us. And that's certainly one example. That's very true, but it can be helpful to widen our definition a little bit of what we mean by gratitude. So more broadly, gratitude is about intentionally noticing and appreciating the positive in the world. So first, we need to notice that those positive things are there, and then take a moment to really intentionally, right, take that step back and intentionally appreciate and embrace them. So this bigger definition, it lets us include the grateful feelings that we might have, even if a specific person wasn't actually involved in the event, right? It's not just an interpersonal thing. It can be lots of things. So for example, many of us have probably at one point or another felt grateful for things like simply just waking up or being able to feel the warmth of the sun, like in this photo. And for those who identify spiritual or religious, this bigger definition also allows for the inclusion of thankful feelings that we may have about generous acts from a higher power or from the universe more generally, right? All of these can be gratitude. It doesn't require a specific human person to do something for us. Now, as straightforward as this might seem, there's also some pretty common misconceptions about what gratitude is. And Robert Emmons, who's a leading gratitude researcher, he's excellently summarized arguments against these misconceptions, and I'll share some of those here. So, like other tools, gratitude isn't simply just about reducing negative emotions or ignoring the negative aspects of a situation. And this is easy to forget, and it's quite intuitive, but again, we forget so often that positive and negative feelings can coexist together at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And gratitude is about intentionally noticing the positive part of our experiences to see the whole picture. So with gratitude, we're increasing our positive emotions without necessarily decreasing the negative ones. They may decrease, but that's not necessarily the goal. So rather than this thing that just makes us naive and ignoring all the negativity, gratitude can help us to keep balance by staying grounded in reality and acknowledge stressful emotions or situations, but it helps us to not become overwhelmed by those and see the whole thing is entirely negative and hopeless. And the second misconception about gratitude is that if we express gratitude, it means that we're undermining our own accomplishments or our own individual contributions or abilities. But again, just like positive and negative emotions can coexist, we can also give credit to others while still taking pride in our accomplishments, right? It doesn't have to be only one or the other. And in fact, acknowledging the vital contributions of others can motivate us to work even harder. And this is because, appreciating how connected and interdependent we are on one another, it helps to inspire a sense of community and connectedness to our fellow humans that motivates us to do more to help each other. And then last, some critics have said that, well, if you express gratitude and are just grateful for what you already have, then it's going to make you lazy and complacent, and you're not going to work hard to achieve your goals anymore because you're happy with how things are. But in fact, the opposite is actually true. So when we're grateful, it means we're appreciating how good we have it and acknowledging that other people are often responsible for many of the good things in our life. And reflecting on that can energize us to keep that good thing going, right? We want to keep it going. And it can also inspire feelings of compassion and generosity because we want to help others experience that goodness too. A perfect example of this is that one of the biggest predictors of monetary donations to hospitals is the fact that the donor has experienced gratitude for healthcare that they've received or that their family has received in the past, right? So this is an example of gratitude inspiring action and monetary assistance rather than the person being just complacent and not doing anything and saying, well, thank you, bye, right? So again, it can be a very powerful motivating force. So in sum, gratitude can help us maintain balance in 3 ways. It keeps us grounded but hopeful. It helps promote a sense of community by reminding us of just how connected we all are as human beings. And it can keep us motivated to work toward our goals and help those around us, right? So this isn't just a quick thank you and that's all we get out of it. There are a lot of good benefits to it. So now I'd like to invite you to practice a brief gratitude exercise with us. Now, the practices we do today should generate pretty positive or peaceful emotions, but if they do happen to cause you discomfort for some reason, please feel free to step away and do what you need to do to calm your nervous system before coming back. So let's begin. And again, you can do this with your eyes closed or open, however you prefer. So once you're settled, I'd like you to imagine a person or an object or perhaps a circumstance in your life that you're grateful for and that's positively impacted your life. This could be a loved one or a trusted coworker, perhaps a family heirloom, or something more abstract like having the opportunity to help others. Whatever comes to mind for you. And really bring to mind what this person, object, or circumstance, what it means to you and how it makes you feel. And really try to see in your mind's eye all the good that this has brought to your life. And now that you're feeling that, I'd like you to imagine what your life would be like if you had never met that person or experienced this object or circumstance, right? As though you had never known it existed. Now, how would your day-to-day life be different? What positive emotions or experiences might you have missed out on if that person, object, or circumstance had never been a part of your life, right? That you didn't even know it was there. Right, and use those thoughts to really experience and feel the ways that this person or circumstance, brings value and goodness to your life and how great it is to be able to experience that goodness. All right, and now that you've had a chance to reflect on this, I'd like you to gently bring yourself back to the present moment and to our webinar we'll just take one quick mindful inhale and exhale. So I'll lead us here. So we'll go ahead and breathe in, hold, and breathe out. And you can open your eyes if they were closed. So, and you can share this in the chat if you feel comfortable. but notice how this exercise made you feel about the person or object or whatever it was that you identified. How might these feelings change the way that you go about your day or how you relate to the world around you? I know for me, a big one that I think about is that opportunity to experience sunlight. I happen to, with my pets, I come outside. Usually the sun is rising, and it never ceases to amaze me how beautiful the sunrise is. And just that little moment of reflection really makes a good start to my morning. Oh, Kathy, great. I'm glad that it made you feel happy. I hope that's the case for everyone here today. All right, let's go ahead and we will transition to our final tool for today, which is self-compassion. So like other tools, it can be helpful to first define what self-compassion is and what it's not. So definitions and knowledge about these concepts, they're always evolving. But today we're going to reference the work of the world's leading self-compassion researcher, Dr. Kristin Neff. And her website has actually been provided in the resources handout. There's a lot of good information there. So Dr. Neff's research has identified 3 key elements that are a part of self-compassion, and we'll summarize those here. First part is what's called self-kindness. So this means that whenever we're suffering or maybe haven't lived up to our expectations or others' expectations, that we're taking a warm and understanding view of ourselves rather than ignoring painful feelings or trying to shame ourselves into being better, right? This often doesn't work and just makes us feel worse about the situation. So put another way, it means that we're accepting that imperfection, difficulty, and suffering, these are inevitable parts of life. And through that acceptance, we can be a little gentler on ourselves rather than intensifying our feelings of failure or inadequacy in ways that keep us stuck. The second part of self-compassion is what's called common humanity. So negative experiences and stress, they can often promote this artificial sense of isolation, right? They can trick us into perceiving that we're the only person in the world right now that's suffering or that's maybe failed at something. So in self-compassion, common humanity means that we're recognizing and appreciating that all humans suffer and feel inadequate at times, right? It is a part of life. And when we recognize that all humans share that experience, this recognition can help us feel a little bit more connected and less isolated or alone in our experience. And just knowing that we're not alone in and of itself can be a very big source of comfort. Well, and then let me then transition to our third point, which is the first tool we discussed today, which is mindfulness. So as Dr. Neff describes it, mindfulness allows us to observe our negative thoughts and emotions with openness and clarity. So to have self-compassion toward our suffering, we first have to acknowledge that it's there, right? We often prefer to just ignore it, but we do have to turn and face it to some extent. But at the same time, Dr. Neff notes that mindfulness allows us to not be over-identified with our thoughts and feelings, meaning we're getting swept away or just completely carried away by those thoughts and feelings. So again, it's important to turn toward our pain and acknowledge it to have self-compassion, but it's equally important to not become swept away by that pain or struggle with it. So it's, again, this balance. So to summarize, self-compassion involves 3 key elements to help us maintain balance. It helps us to be kind to ourselves, it helps us appreciate that we're not alone in our suffering or imperfection, and it helps us take a mindful stance toward our own suffering. So those are the 3 pieces of self-compassion. And like we've done with the other tools, let's distinguish it from some other concepts that don't necessarily promote resilience. And Dr. Neff has excellently described these arguments on her website. And again, I'm summarizing some of these here, so I really do want to credit these excellent researchers for their work. So first, self-compassion is not the same as pitying ourselves or sort of taking this woe is me stance toward life. So as Dr. Neff puts it, when we're pitying ourselves, it means we're becoming so wrapped up in ourselves and our own problems that we're actually disconnecting from other people and developing a warped and imbalanced view of our suffering, right? And this is the opposite of self-compassion. So self-compassion is not the same as self-pity. And self-compassion is also not the same as being complacent or just coddling ourselves. Right? There might be this idea that self-compassion means we're just letting ourselves off the hook, no accountability for pressing responsibilities or problems in our life, and we're just constantly lounging on our couch with our favorite snacks and comfort items. But self-compassion is about ensuring our well-being over the long term. And so this regularly means that we're putting ourselves actually through discomfort or difficulty in the service of a meaningful goal or improving our life. So often is the case that having compassion for ourselves means we're actually pushing ourselves to do those hard or uncomfortable things specifically because we care deeply about ourselves. It's a little counterintuitive, while also knowing that it is really okay sometimes to take that relaxing break when it's needed. Right? Again, allowing ourselves some of that kindness. Sometimes that nice relaxing time on the couch is exactly what we need. Now, much like gratitude, self-compassion can help us stay balanced in a couple of different ways. Right? It keeps us motivated by combating the negative effects of shaming ourselves while still holding ourselves accountable. Right? That piece is still there. It helps us to stay connected, right? Because we remember that we're not alone and suffering is something that everybody experiences. And finally, self-compassion helps us stay mindful as we try to turn toward our struggles without becoming overwhelmed by them. We need both pieces. And so for today, let's do one more exercise with self-compassion. So again, take a moment to get comfortable in your seat or laying down if you prefer. And I'd like you to first think about a situation in your life that's been bothering you or annoying you. And for today, I'd like us to stick to something that's a relatively minor stressor for you. So something that bothers you, but that you know it's not catastrophic. Right? Maybe you had a typo in an important email, or maybe you got some negative feedback that you know is minor, but you still can't seem to move past it. And try to really get in touch with that situation and the feelings that it brings up for you. You can really feel that experience in your mind's eye. And now imagine that a friend is experiencing your exact situation and feelings, right? They are going through the exact same thing. Now, as you would try to support your friend, what might you say to them? What kind of tone would you have maybe as you say those supportive words to them? Maybe you tell them that you've been there before. You know, we all make mistakes and that you can see that they're stressed, but that's all okay. Right? Imagine yourself sending these words or maybe other kind words and gestures of support to your friend. Really feel what it's like to send those feelings of positivity and support and kindness to them. And now, see if you can direct that same kind and supportive language and energy back to yourself in that same situation. Right? We all experience stress, and you are no less deserving of that compassion in this situation than your friend is. Again, really channel that same language you gave to your friend to yourself. And as you channel that support, notice any changes in how you feel about the situation and yourself when you give yourself this kindness and recognition that we all stumble from time to time and that that's okay. And again, we'll gently bring ourselves back to the webinar with a quick mindful inhale and exhale that I'll lead now. So go ahead and breathe in, hold, and breathe out. All right, so now I'll go ahead and hand it off to Kathy to run through our takeaways for today and close out our webinar.
Thank you, Trevor. That was so interesting. And I love that last gratitude exercise. You know, allowing grace for ourselves is sometimes really hard. So let's do a quick review of the main takeaways from today. Be mindful of those mental shortcuts. As I mentioned, the example that came to my mind was about that concert experience. But be mindful of those mental shortcuts. They're not always helpful. Notice when you use them and assess whether or not it's getting you to a good result. This is sometimes easier said than done. I hadn't considered the concert one until I thought of it in Trevor's comments. So it's not always easy to recognize your shortcuts, but it's important. Reflect on how you're thinking about a situation. Reflecting on how you're thinking about a situation will help you identify the shortcut, and then you'll notice whether or not it's serving you. Step back and see the whole picture. Awareness of the context helps you maintain a more balanced viewpoint and also make sure you're including all the information in your decision. And like most anything, maintaining balance is a skill that's learned and strengthened through practice. So be patient with yourself. It takes a little time to develop the skill and then practice to keep it a strong skill. So you may have noticed some of our slides today had little footnote indicators to indicate our source materials. We wanted to include those here in case you want to dig deeper into any of them. So in this slide presentation, which is available on that website, and I'll share that link with you one more time here in the chat. That presentation does have this slide in it, so if you're interested in any of those source materials, you can find them. So finally, let's take a minute and think back over what we talked about today and what you've learned. How might you apply what you've learned in your day-to-day world? What's one concept that you learned from today's webinar? How has it changed the way you think about concepts like mindfulness or other positive framing strategies? And how can you apply today's concepts to more intentionally find balance during chronic stress? You're welcome to share your thoughts in the chat if you like, but certainly that's not required. I love this, Sophia. Thank you. Self-compassion is a necessity. Yes. And I find of all the things, that one's one of the hardest to do. As I'm sure many of you are built similarly, I always want it to be the best. I always want it done as quickly as possible. I don't want to go quite so far as to say I'm a perfectionist, but yeah, always striving for it to be the best. And when I miss that mark, it's hard to give myself compassion sometimes. So absolutely. So this concludes the webinar. I want to thank you for joining us today.